Hello and welcome to Culture Context presented by Urban Fusion. My name is LeRonn Brooks and I'll be your host. Today we have Mendi and Keith Obadike, two artists working in a number of media, primarily in music and literature. They've been the recipients of numerous awards, including the Rockefeller New Media Arts Fellowship, the Pick Ledidi Award for Digital Art, a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship in Fiction, and a Victor's Fellowship from USC. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, yeah.
So you guys work on a number of platforms and new media, right?
Yeah.
And how would you define new media? Because it's a category that not many people really understand or can define, but you guys, I mean, do you accept new media as a definition for what you guys do?
I think we say we make art, music, and literature.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of our work might be categorized. We would probably just say media art.
Media.
Right, because new media is always relative and it's always changing, and stuff that used to be called new media is now sort of everyday technology.
We could say that we work as conceptual artists across media.
Sure.
You know,
right.
So.
Yeah.
I mean, the work, I mean, for me, what I really love about your work is that you have all of these different elements in the work. Sound, at times performance, and you integrate all of these different elements into spaces that change at times, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, how would you describe your approach to the different spaces you guys commissioned to make work in? Like, how do you integrate all of those elements into these different spaces?
I mean, I think I would say that every project is unique, right? We're just starting to move into making sort of public art. Which is, we've been going in that direction slowly for a number of years, but we're sort of really just getting our feet in that water now. We've been making performance pieces for a number of years now, in large theater spaces and small black box spaces.
You could say that the net art that we used to make was public art in a way too, but it's not the same thing as being in a public space. It's publicly available. But.
Right. One of the first times I saw you guys, we were talking about this before, you had this, you integrated an online auction house into your work. Would you want to speak about that? You worked on eBay, right? And you were selling identity.
Yeah.
You know, would you want to describe that?
We auctioned Keith's blackness on eBay. The list of warnings and benefits.
Well, eBay canceled the auction after 4 days, so this was 2001. And at that point, a lot of artists were starting to, well, a lot of artists had been working online. That kind of work was more popular in Europe, not so much in the US, and we're in this kind of small community of sort of self-described new media artists. And so we were kind of making the project for that world. I mean, we kind of thought of it as a media art project, but it kind of circulated beyond the art community and kind of took on a life of its own. And so for us, you know, it was about how identity functions online. But, you know, it became a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
And so when you auction yourself off, I mean, that's a lot of history in there. You know, black man auctioning himself, trying to get, and so the responses, how were the responses to that?
There were a variety of responses. I mean, there were people who wanted to communicate with us and offered to offer trades of white femaleness, and you know, had questions about the shipping cost of blackness and things like that.
Is it perishable, or can you take it off at night? Or, so yeah, there are a lot of questions like that. A lot of them were hilarious. You know, only a few people, a small number of people, were actually offended by the piece. You know. But there are a lot of different readings of it depending on where people saw it, and so this was a time when people were really just starting to pay attention to ideas on the internet becoming viral. And so the piece resonated one way in Ireland, another way in South Africa, another way in Russia, you know. So it's interesting to watch the kind of international response to what we thought of as a kind of small media art project. We intended it for an American audience, and to see how people thought about blackness across the world because of this kind of text-based online piece was kind of interesting for us.
Yeah.
So it spread through like all of these different territories, and then people, it sounds like people were like really engaged with the idea of, you know, blackness being something that's malleable, that's something, you know, that can be bought and sold as like a product, you know, and so people were actually participating in like really interesting ways, right?
Well, I think, I mean, there are a lot of ways that blackness is already for sale, and I think a lot of people kind of got that and enjoyed being able to participate in a conversation about that. And that was interesting to me, that a lot of people sort of understood what we were responding to, even in contexts where maybe blackness resonates somewhat differently, even in the art world, you know.
Everyone has their own private blackness.
Or public.
Or public blackness.
Or public, yeah.
It's really interesting. I mean, so let's speed it up to 2009, right? And For Electric Ghosts, which is, you know, it was an opera. Masquerade performance at the Kitchen. It seemed like a massive project. Like you were coordinating all of these different aspects, the choreography for the dancing, the singing, and then it had this like really intense visual aspect to it, right? So, I mean, can you describe that particular piece?
Well, yeah, I mean, first we should say that we had a great team. So, yeah, we don't want to give the impression that we did. I mean, we had Paloma McGregor, who did the choreography for it, and her sister Patricia McGregor, who did some of the staging for it. We had a whole design team. So yeah, it was a big team, a lot of support, and so yeah, I mean, we've been working on the ideas for a while, and we got to that piece because we've been working on all these projects about color in different ways, and strangely, I mean, that led us to Pac-Man and these sort of color-coded ghosts and the ghost algorithms. But we were also pulling themes from this novel, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, and kind of mashing those things up. Because we've done a lot of projects over the years that combine themes from two different stories, and so we kind of saw ourselves as mixing these two themes. We
also were working on projects that put together different elements of music, image, narrative, and so we know that these are old traditions. So people thought of this as some kind of multimedia work, but we were saying, well, we're working in the tradition even before we did an opera masquerade of these live performances, African masquerades, particularly American operas, what we were thinking about. And so we finally actually made a project that responded to those older forms as well by putting together those elements.
And I'm thinking of Pac-Man. I mean, that's an interesting, you know, source to sort of get a concept of choreography or movement. And so that connects back to the sort of electric sensibility. I mean, as a kid of the 80s, I mean, Pac-Man was just one of those things, right? And so, like, you're using a resource that is kind of generational. I mean, it's sort of a new interpretation of the ways in which, you know, we are integrated into the sort of electric world, like from Atari to, and you're like including that in the process of what you make.
Yeah, well, in our net.art projects, we had a number of different online games, you know, responding to those video games. I mean, we'd always thought about that as a resource, as a kind of like folk tale of our time, you know? And so when we did For Electric Ghosts, we wanted to flip it. Instead of making a game about a narrative, we wanted to make a narrative that responded to game-like structures.
Yeah, all of our games are kind of simple and these kind of 8-bit things that all sort of harking back to this stuff. But Pac-Man is the sort of iconic video game folk narrative.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, they have their own storylines. Like Pac-Man has a story. You have to, you know, run from the ghosts. You know, you have to miss Pac-Man. You know, there's always these narratives formed around these video games. And so, like, for the opera, you guys made this narrative, and the narrative is played out in phases, right? I mean, I mean, for me, just thinking about what we're talking about, like, Pac-Man has different levels, right? These kind of different phases, and then next level is harder, next level is harder. Like, how do you understand like these different phases of the opera, from changing from one to another to another?
Yeah, so in the opera, I mean, we had levels, and you could actually see the levels projected on the rear wall in the theater. So there's a kind of video game interface that you saw as you heard the music and saw the dance. But our narrative operated on a number of different levels at the same time. So each ghost in our story, there are 4 ghosts, they also sort of represented the day of the week. Like in Igbo culture in Nigeria, there are 4 market days, all right? So each ghost had a color, each ghost had a day of the week, each ghost had a
direction,
a direction, a geographical direction. And so, I mean, we pull those ideas from a lot of folklore. And so those things impacted the story as well.
We should also say that we wanted to tell our story from the perspective of the ghosts because, you know, in the game and also in the My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, in that novel, we're invited to think about the perspective of this invading mortal person without really thinking about what they're doing to this world, you know, how that there's a world that exists before this mortal ends up in that world and eats everything. And so what does it mean to the ghost, you know, to have this child who's voracious and, you know, wants to get away with things and does.
Nobody thinks about the ghosts.
Nobody thinks about the ghosts.
So each of the ghosts has a story in the land of the dead and has to interact with this mortal.
Yeah, haunting ain't easy.
Haunting ain't easy. And so, so you bring this international sensibility, right? You know, haunting. Like in you know, certain cultures in Africa, like ghosts have this really prominent place, right? And so the life of the spiritual realms, you know, you sort of bring that in, and you're like this really interesting mashup of like electric ghosts, you know, the Pac-Man game, but then you bring in, you know, the sort of folklore aspect, you know, from traditional beliefs. Like, was it a sort of a natural combination to bring in these traditional beliefs and then this kind of electronic new mythology?
I think on some level people are thinking about these things anyway. When you see the games are always pulling on older stories, right? So we're just kind of making those things explicit, right? So the strength of the games is they build on archetypes, right? But we're trying to put those things out front, I think, with our piece.
Yeah, and I think we're often responding to Igbo cosmology and ideology.
Sure.
So that's just a part of how we are processing the world and creativity and, you know, the resources that we have. The cultural resources that we have, and what we want to say to the world too.
And you know, you're putting Africa forward, right? You're putting Africa forward in ways that are kind of new. I mean, you know, you mix that, you know, African traditional beliefs with Pac-Man. I mean, that's an interesting kind of new mashup sensibility there. I mean, what do you think it does to these traditional narratives that you're actually updating it in this particular way? Does it change those old narratives?
Well, I mean, part of what we were referencing in the show was this novel, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, and that novel already has a kind of speculative feel, you know, and so. In some ways, you know, we weren't really updating it as much as putting it in this video game context and putting the video game stuff in a folklore context. So we think these things already sort of exist in the same realm together, but we're kind of sort of shining a light on sort of intersections.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a kind of interest in technology in that novel that was published before we were born. You know what I mean? So
1954.
Yeah.
So you guys have this new piece at Ramapo College entitled African Metropole, Sonic City, Lagos. Would you want to describe that piece?
African Metropole is the Sonic City Lagos one is the first in a series of sound installations about African cities. And we're pulling on something that happened in the early 20th century, people making films about cities, usually European cities or some American cities as well.
There were these city symphony films that were done in the 20s and 30s, and they were mainly silent films. They were sort of portraits, meditations on cities. So these pieces were all silent, and so we're kind of revisiting that idea, but through sound installations. So our installations are sound-driven. They don't have images, but they are portraits. They are sort of songs for these cities.
So you're reversing right? So if one is like images, you're using sound.
Right.
So if one is using, these films are using images to actually give visuals of these different cityscapes, you are actually going to the opposite by using sound.
I don't know if it's really an opposite though, because we believe that people have images when they listen. There's a different kind of thinking, a different kind of meditation that happens with sound, but you don't escape, you don't escape imagining an image.
Right.
And we're also kind of thinking about these things as drawings, because in the installations use these kind of narrow focused speakers. Hypersonic emitters are what they call. And so you don't hear the sound unless you interrupt the beam. It's a really narrow beam, and these speakers actually pan across the space. So you actually have a kind of sense of a line in the space. And so it's something we wanted to do for years, and we finally, the technology has sort of gotten to a place where we can do these things. Right. And so they are visual pieces for us. They are kind of sonic pieces that represent the city in a visual way.
Right. And so when you think of like Lagos, I mean, it's a city with like a lot of activity, right? It's a city with a lot of, just a vibrant sensibility to it. Like, how do you bring that vibe, that sort of vibrant spirit into the gallery space? I mean, so this is smells. I mean, you have so many senses when you're in the city, smells, and you're not just visual, but all of these other aspects. But you emphasize the sound. Like, is it a direct transmission of just purely sound? I mean, or like, what do you expect your viewer to actually get from it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that some of the things that we've chosen to do in the installation are an almost documentary-like representation of the city. So you hear a straight recording in a really representational way, so you know that you're on a freeway, and if you know the city, you might even know where we are in the city. Other times, the sounds are extremely abstracted, so you hear something in close proximity, so much so that you wouldn't recognize the original industrial source of that sound. So there are key locations in the city that are recorded at different moments, and other times things are stretched out and morphed.
There's also a poem in that soundscape, and there are other musical sounds, so it's a dialogue between a couple of different registers of sonic information.
I mean, but there's also like a process of listening. Like, in terms of like being in New York, you go to the street corner and then you wait. You hear the cars stop, and then you know how to move. So this is kind of process of going through these different phases of sound before you get to the train or before you get to where you're going. Now, do you actually mimic that process in terms of, or do you allow these different sounds to sort of exist at the same time? I mean, so if someone is going somewhere, right, they can sort of predict that path because of the different transitions in the sound.
Oh, yeah. There's certain moments in the installation. I mean, it moves through a few phases, but there are certain moments when we want some of the signals of that city to be recognizable, right? So if you go to a city like Lagos, the way that people navigate the highways is incredible. It's unique to that city, right? There are these honks, and people yelling out the window, and only a driver from that city can navigate that freeway. In the same way that, a pedestrian in New York can navigate the street in a particular kind of way. So sometimes we present that in a straightforward fashion so people can appreciate the magic that is a kind of highway in Lagos. Other times, like I said, we're pulling things out and we're abstracting them to make them more musical or to create our own kind of narrative inside the natural sounds of the city.
I mean, it's interesting that you guys work with the notion of coding, right? If you want to go back to Pac-Man, codes make the language, which makes the video, right? And so in that particular sense, you have this sense of electric coding and then the sense of biological coding. And so, I mean, there are these processes by which things come to be visualized, right? And so if it's Pac-Man, you get this electric game that's on a television screen. When it comes to biological coding, right, you get different variations of people. Like, where did that start? Like, this intense interest. Did you guys start with computers, or, I mean, were you like always interested in the notion of coding, or?
I think it might have been about where color and language come together. We did this project called Interaction of Colors.
Have colors.
And we were kind of thinking about, we took text from Joseph Albert's Interaction of Colors, and we made an
It was a color theory book. That, you know.
And we made an online brown paper bag test.
The brown paper bag test for the viewers is, you know, if you're old, thinking African American culture, if you're darker than the brown paper bag, you can't have entry into clubs or venues or what have you. Black people doing that to other black people.
Yeah, and they call it different things in different places. I think, you know, some places they call it a pencil test or a ruler test. But yeah, so we made a kind of online digital version of this in 2002 for the Whitney's Art Port, right? And so people would fill out our form, they would send us in photos, and we'd send them back a hex code with their color specification. And the idea was that our hex code number was a more precise way of describing color than the old-fashioned way.
Because on your screens, you couldn't really tell if somebody was really whatever you want to call people by skin color. Yeah.
Right.
And so we were thinking about the ways that the language and the actual color, the perception, gave people access or denied people access to different kind of social environments. And so. And we had a form to fill out because, you know, if you're the darkest person in your family, that's different from, you know, you could be lighter than, you know, the lightest person in someone else's family, you know, and so that context meant everything. How you code
this is some dangerous territory, you guys. You know, I mean, for a lot of people, it's the root of, you know, who they are, how they exist in the world, and, you know, I mean, you're really getting underneath, you know, the surface of what, you know, a lot of people in America, not just in America, but internationally, we talk about color, you talk about how color, you know, connects to one's treatment in the world, how you perform your identity in relation to your color. I mean, you know, have people sort of responded in negative ways to this, what you guys are?
Well, I think with that project, I mean, people sort of took it lightly and they kind of had fun with it for the most part.
Well, we didn't have negative responses. I think there were a lot of funny questions, and I think people sort of responded most vocally to the humor in the project, or to the humor of trying to make an online brown paper bag test or something, or using Joseph Albert's to do that. But then some people who filled out our form, I mean, we asked questions like, have you ever tried to lighten your skin? Have you ever tried to darken your skin? What part has your hair color ever been lighter than your skin? You know, and people told us things like that they tried to bleach their skin. I mean, people told, or
they're that honest.
Or you know, or said, you know, list all the slurs that members of your family have called you around color, you know, or strangers have called you, and people had some really kind of heavy things that they told us. So those weren't the conversations we had about that project, but those are the things that came out in dialogue through the project. You know?
So people are in a way an extension of your medium. You know, I mean, you're kind of asking questions and affecting people in a way that they're thinking about, you know, what is their relationship to the world they live in. So like the interactions of people or how they receive your work, I mean, they're actually being changed, you know.
And so are we.
Yeah, I mean, we are doing these projects to have conversations with people. But it's interesting how these things play out. I mean, when we did that project, that was 2002, and it was a sort of mock e-business. I mean, that's how we built the website for that project. But now, I mean, some of these things are becoming real. I mean, now we have sort of online identity systems that you know, I mean, Facebook is becoming that. People are now using sort of Facebook to check into certain airlines. I think KLM is doing something where you can use Facebook, I think, to decide who you want to sit beside on the plane.
Is that right?
That's real. That's here now.
Really?
Yeah.
You know? And the picture, dude, you know, and all that. So that's wow. Wow.
So, you know, this color coding stuff is not as far off as we thought in 2002.
So people can actually, instead of like working toward sort of becoming accustomed to diversity, people can actually use technology to go back in terms of, I don't want to sit next to this particular person based upon
social filtering, you know.
Social filtering, right? And so you guys like jump into the middle of that. Right. I mean, that's tricky. That's really sort of tricky territory. And so when you deal with, I mean, this kind of material, right? When you deal with like race and you deal with identity, I mean, it's really, you know, a particular situation in which you are asking people to be wide open, right? And so how people perform, you know, in terms of their identity, and you go back to the Electric Ghost, and so people are performing identity in that particular way, right? Pac-Man is performing identity, the ghosts are performing identity. So, I mean, is there a way in which people can just be and that they're not performing, or, you know, like you're dissecting people's identity?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the opera masquerades are different from the sort of public art pieces or the online pieces where we're asking the public to interact. You know, I think people respond one way when you see sort of professional performers on stage in costumes. I mean, that's a certain kind of interaction, and there's something else where you ask people to fill out a form and tell you very personal details about themselves.
Yeah.
But then can they hide behind their computers?
Well, interestingly, you know, originally we did that piece online, but we recently went through the same process with a group of students where we were in a room and we asked them to fill out this long form about their identity, and it was a really sort of interesting conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, we were in a room with students that we probably would have said were mostly white, but interesting things came out when they filled out this long form about identity and heritage and where their parents came from and about their own skin color.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, our forum asks several generations back, and so I don't know if all of those students would have just said they were white ordinarily, but they had a lot of stories. You know,
they had a lot of stories in terms of
surprisingly complex stories about their own identity and about their choice to describe themselves as white or not white. Right?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So, I mean, when you're given these boxes, white, black, like how does it all filter down to this one particular box instead of a mix of boxes?
Yeah.
Right? And so, like, how do you, I mean, so when you perform in public, you have this sensibility that you see the people. When they're behind the computer, you're actually using questionnaires to sort of pull people out.
Yeah.
You know, and you're expecting, but when you pull people out, they give you like all this baggage. You said in terms of the stories they tell you, they give you all this baggage, right? Yeah. I don't mean baggage in a negative way, right? But when they give you all of this particular history, but then like, how do you process all this particular history? Like, how do you use that as material to bring out some kind of higher meaning, the art, right? Like, how do you use that to bring out some kind of higher meaning?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways that, you know, we can. Sometimes people, when we have a lot of questions in our work,
right?
Like, I mean, sort of in the kind of intellectual, like distant way, but also our work often actually literally asks questions of people. And I think sometimes people say, what are you going to do with these answers? As if the questioning is not the work itself, you know, and the kind of the questioning and the answering is not. So I think there's a part of it that's just about, you know, asking a question, having a question posed, hearing an answer. That changes us, and we don't know what it does for the other people, but that in itself is something. Because
it may be the first time that they're really asked this in a very direct way, right? Instead of performing, they have to sort of unpack. And then once they unpack, they sort of give it to you, and now they're vulnerable.
And they can perform. I mean, it's okay to perform. It's okay to lie on a form. People lie on forms every day.
I know nothing about that. I know nothing about that.
But that's a valid interaction, I think.
Right.
I think that's a valid interaction.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for being on the show. The time is up. It goes so quick, right? It goes so quick. Thank you, everyone, for watching this episode of Culture Context with Mendi and Keith Obadike. Take care.